Bank manager refuses service a man in a MAGA hat. Freezes when he returns as a vice president. The clock struck 11 a.m. at First Horizon Bank in Waco, Texas. The hum of printers and quiet conversations filled the air as the midday crowd settled into the familiar rhythm of transactions. Men in business suits juggled their paperwork and coffee cups, while retirees exchanged polite smiles, waiting for their turn. Behind her desk sat Brenda Hartwell, the seasoned bank manager, her sharp gaze moving methodically between a pile of loan applications. Brenda's 20 years in the industry had taught her many things, and one of them was to run a tight ship. She prided herself on maintaining order even when the occasional difficult customer disrupted the day. But nothing in her years of experience had prepared her for what would happen next. The faint creak of the entrance door caught Brenda's attention. She glanced up briefly and noticed a man walking in. His appearance instantly stood out. Over 6 feet tall, wearing a red baseball cap emblazoned with the bold white letters, "Make America Great Again." He clutched a small briefcase in one hand and glanced around the room as though assessing his surroundings. His casual demeanor clashed sharply with the polished professionalism of the bank's usual patrons. Brenda's jaw tightened. That hat, it was a symbol she couldn't ignore. Brenda had seen what it represented to people in her community. Last month, an argument between 2 customers about politics had escalated so loudly that it nearly disrupted the bank's operations for hours. She wasn't about to let something like that happen again. She leaned slightly toward Diane, her assistant, manager seated at a neighboring desk. "Watch that guy," Brenda whispered, her tone clipped. "I don't want any trouble." Diane gave a hesitant nod, her brow furrowing as she followed Brenda's gaze. The man was already making his way to the line for customer service, waiting patiently behind an older woman counting coins into a tray. He didn't seem out of place, and yet Brenda's unease only grew. When it was his turn, the man bypassed the teller line entirely and approached Brenda's desk. His steps were unhurried, but purposeful. Brenda straightened in her chair, bracing herself. "Good afternoon," the man said with a polite nod, his voice calm and steady. "I'd need to make a withdrawal from my account." Brenda maintained a neutral expression, though her pulse quickened. "Do you have your account details and ID?" she asked, her tone professional but cool. "Yes, of course," he replied, setting a folded sheet of paper and his driver's license on the desk. He waited silently as she picked up the documents and began to review them. The ID matched the account details. Everything seemed legitimate, but Brenda's focus kept drifting back to the red hat perched atop his head. Her mind replayed last month's scene of shouting customers and the headache that followed. She couldn't shake the feeling that this man's presence was a precursor to another disruption. Brenda slid the documents back across the desk, her decision already made. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice firm. "We won't be able to process your request today." The man blinked, his polite demeanor giving way to a flicker of confusion. "Excuse me?" he asked. "Is there an issue with my account?" "No issue," Brenda replied curtly. "But we reserve the right to refuse service if we feel it's warranted." A murmur rippled through the customers nearby. Some exchanged puzzled glances. Others glanced at the man with curiosity. His expression remained calm, though his tone sharpened ever so slightly. "I'd like to understand what you mean by warranted," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong." Brenda hesitated, her voice dropping as she leaned forward. "Look, I don't want to argue. If you'd like, you can speak to another branch about this." For a moment, the man simply stared at her, as if weighing his next move. Then, with a slight shrug, he gathered his documents and adjusted his cap. "Understood," he said simply, his voice devoid of malice. He turned and walked out, the heavy glass door closing behind him with a dull thud. The room felt heavy with tension. Whispers broke out among the customers. A retired man near the door muttered to a woman next to him, "Who was that guy? Didn't seem like a troublemaker to me." Another woman, younger and dressed in a business suit, shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Private businesses can make their own rules. Maybe he did something before we got here." Brenda overheard the conversations, but kept her eyes fixed on her computer screen. Her fingers trembled slightly as she resumed typing, pretending to be unaffected. Yet the man's calm demeanor unsettled her far more than if he had caused a scene. Most people in his situation would have argued, raised their voices, or at least asked for the corporate number to file a complaint. But this man, he had walked out with quiet control that felt almost deliberate. By the end of the day, the incident had become the talk of the branch. Employees whispered in hushed tones, speculating about the man. "Did you see his face? He wasn't even mad," one teller said to another. "Do you think he'll come back?" "People like that usually do," the second replied with a shrug. Brenda waved them off, locking her office door behind her as she left for the night. She told herself the situation was resolved. The man would move on to another bank. After all, people like him didn't cause trouble in person. They stirred it online. As she drove home, Brenda couldn't shake the image of the man's calm departure. The red hat, the unreadable expression, the polite but pointed way he had handled her refusal, it all felt unsettlingly significant. She turned on the radio to drown out her thoughts, but the country station she loved offered little distraction. "Tomorrow," she thought as she pulled into her driveway, "this will all blow over." Brenda couldn't have been more wrong. The morning sun bathed the First Horizon Bank in Waco with a warm, golden glow. Inside, the atmosphere was as ordinary as ever, with the quiet murmur of customer conversations and the rhythmic clatter of keyboards filling the space. Brenda Hartwell arrived early, as she always did, armed with her usual coffee and clipboard. She told herself that today would be just another day. Yesterday's incident with the man in the MAGA hat had been unsettling, but she was confident. It was behind her. By mid-morning, the regular flow of customers began to trickle in, and Brenda's initial apprehension faded into the background. She had already scolded herself for overthinking the encounter. The man hadn't returned, and why would he? There were other banks in town, and customers like him usually didn't go out of their way to escalate things in person. Brenda convinced herself she had made the right decision. After all, her priority was to maintain order in her branch. But at precisely 10 a.m., the bank door swung open with a noticeable force, and everything changed. Brenda glanced up and felt her heart skip a beat. The man from yesterday had returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Two sharply dressed men flanked him, their tailored suits and stern expressions exuding authority. The man himself wore the same red MAGA hat, but something about his posture had shifted. He walked with a quiet confidence that seemed to silence the room. The usual hum of the bank operations halted as customers and staff turned their attention to the trio. Whispers rippled through the room as people instinctively moved aside, making an unspoken path for the man and his companions. Brenda froze, gripping the edges of her desk. "That's the guy from yesterday," Diane whispered, leaning toward Brenda, her voice trembling slightly. "I see him," Brenda replied under her breath, her tone clipped. "No, Brenda, look closer," Diane insisted, her eyes widening as the man drew nearer. That's J.D. Vance." Brenda blinked, confused. "J.D. Vance? What are you talking about?" Diane nodded toward the man, her voice barely audible. "Look at him. That's the vice president." Brenda's stomach dropped. The words didn't register at first, but as she studied the man's face, recognition dawned. The casual attire, the unassuming demeanor. It hadn't matched her mental image of someone so powerful. But now, standing in front of her, there was no mistaking him. J.D. Vance, Vice President of the United States, was in her bank, and she had denied him service yesterday. The room seemed to shrink as JD approached her desk. He removed his cap slowly, revealing the familiar face that had graced countless news articles and television interviews. His expression was calm, but his gaze was piercing. "Good morning," JD said, his voice measured yet commanding. "May I have a word?" Brenda's throat tightened. She managed a strained smile, scrambling to compose herself. "Of course, Mr. Vice President," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. JD raised a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. "Let's not pretend this didn't happen," he said calmly. "Yesterday, I came into this bank as a regular customer, and you refused to serve me. I'm not here to argue, Brenda. I'm here to talk about why." Brenda felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. JD didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone demanded attention. "I understand that we all make judgments," JD continued, his tone even. "It's human nature, but sometimes those judgments say more about us than they do about the people we judge." He set his red MAGA hat on the counter, the bold white letters facing outward. Brenda flinched, as if the fabric itself carried weight. "This hat," JD said, gesturing toward it, "is just fabric and thread. To some, it's a symbol. To others, it's a target. Yesterday it was enough to deny me service, not because of my actions, but because of what you assumed about me." The room was so quiet that even the faint hum of the air conditioning felt deafening. Brenda's cheeks burned as she struggled to form a response. She began, but JD cut her off gently. "I'm not here to shame you," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I'm here to remind all of us that the world is more complicated than it seems. We don't always know someone's story. We don't know their intentions. And if we let our assumptions guide us, we risk missing out on something or someone extraordinary." JD's words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Brenda stared at the hat, her shame mounting with every passing second. She wanted to explain herself, to say that her decision yesterday wasn't personal, but as JD's calm, unwavering gaze bore into her, she realized that any defense she gave would sound hollow. The vice president straightened slightly, his eyes sweeping across the room. "I believe we can all do better," he said, addressing not just Brenda but everyone present. "That's why I came back, not to demand an apology, but to spark a conversation. We have the power to treat each other with dignity and respect, no matter our differences. It's not always easy, but it's necessary." For a moment, Brenda felt the weight of his words pierce through her carefully constructed walls. She had prided herself on being a leader, on making tough decisions for the good of her branch. But in this moment, she saw her actions through a different lens. JD wasn't just speaking to her, he was speaking to everyone, including himself. JD leaned forward slightly, his gaze softening. "Brenda," he said, his voice low but steady, "I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who, like many of us, acted on an assumption. But assumptions can be dangerous. They can hurt people. They can close doors we didn't even realize were open." Brenda's voice cracked as she finally managed to whisper, "I didn't mean to offend you." JD tilted his head slightly. "I know," he said simply. "Most of the time people don't mean to, but what we do afterward, that's what defines us." With that, JD stepped back, his presence as commanding as ever. The room remained silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. "Thank you for your time," JD said, nodding politely. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, his aides flanking him as they exited the bank. The glass door swung shut with a soft click, leaving Brenda standing behind her desk, shaken and speechless. For the first time in her career, she felt truly humbled. The room remained silent long after J.D. Vance and his aides had left. Brenda stood frozen at her desk, the red MAGA hat still sitting where JD had placed it. She wanted to move, to do something, but the weight of the moment pinned her in place. Around her the bank buzzed with hushed conversations. Customers murmured among themselves, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. That was the Vice President of the United States, Diane whispered, her voice trembling, and he came back just to talk to you. Brenda didn't respond. She felt like the ground beneath her had shifted, and she was struggling to find her footing. The realization that she had denied service to one of the most powerful men in the country weighed on her like a lead blanket. But what haunted her more than the potential professional fallout was the calm, unshakable way JD had confronted her. He hadn't raised his voice or made demands. Instead, he had delivered a message that struck directly at the heart of her actions. The sound of the bank door swinging open snapped Brenda out of her daze. A man in a dark suit walked in, holding a sleek black folder. He approached Brenda's desk with purpose, his expression professional but unreadable. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice steady, "Mr. Vance left this for you." The man handed Brenda the folder and turned to leave without another word. Brenda stared at it, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, neatly printed with a bold heading, "Donation Pledge." Her eyes widened as she read the document. J.D. Vance had pledged a $500,000 donation to the Waco Community Relief Fund, a local charity that supported underprivileged families and struggling small businesses. The bank had long been a partner in managing the fund, but it had never seen a contribution of this magnitude. Brenda felt her throat tighten. She could barely process the numbers on the page. A donation this large could transform the fund's operations, allowing it to expand its reach and help countless more people. Gasps rippled through the room as Brenda shared the news. Customers and employees alike crowded around her desk, their disbelief turning into a hum of excitement. $500,000, one teller whispered. "That's incredible." Diane leaned over, her voice low but urgent. "Brenda, this changes everything. The media's going to pick up on this. You need to call corporate right now." Brenda nodded, but her mind was racing. She knew Diane was right. It wouldn't be long before word of the Vice President's visit and his extraordinary generosity spread like wildfire. The bank would have to issue a statement, and Brenda would undoubtedly find herself at the center of the storm. By that afternoon, the story had already gone viral. A few customers who had been in the bank during JD's visit had recorded snippets of his speech and posted them online. Clips of the Vice President calmly addressing Brenda, juxtaposed with the image of his red MAGA hat on the counter, flooded social media. Local news outlets were quick to pick up the story. Headlines like "Vice President confronts bank bias" and "JD Vance donates $500K to Waco Community Relief Fund" dominated websites and broadcasts. Brenda's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls and emails from corporate headquarters, demanding an explanation and updates on the situation. Sitting in her office, Brenda drafted an official statement with trembling hands. She chose her words, carefully acknowledging the incident while trying to balance accountability with damage control. "We deeply regret the misunderstanding that occurred at our branch and are committed to ensuring that all customers are treated with respect and fairness," the statement read. "We are honored to manage Vice President Vance's generous donation to the Waco Community Relief Fund and will work diligently to ensure it makes a meaningful impact." Despite her efforts, Brenda couldn't escape the scrutiny. By the end of the day, reporters were stationed outside the bank, hoping to capture any updates or interviews. Employees avoided making eye contact with her, and customers who usually greeted her warmly now watched her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. While Brenda wrestled with her guilt and the public fallout, the Waco Community Relief Fund was experiencing an unprecedented surge of support. JD's donation had sparked a ripple effect, inspiring local businesses and residents to contribute to the fund. Evelyn Parker, the fund's director, held a press conference to express her gratitude. "This donation is transformative," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "It will allow us to expand our programs, support more families, and make a lasting impact in our community. We are deeply grateful to Vice President Vance for his generosity and his belief in the power of kindness." The Relief Fund's office, a modest building in downtown Waco, was suddenly bustling with activity. Volunteers fielded calls from donors and organized plans for new initiatives, including financial literacy workshops and small business grants. For a fund that had struggled for years to secure significant contributions, JD's pledge was nothing short of a miracle. As Brenda sat in her office that evening, watching the news coverage of the press conference, she felt a deep pang of regret. JD's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "Assumptions can close doors we didn't even realize were open." She realized now how narrowly she had viewed the man who had walked into her bank the day before. Brenda closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She had spent years believing she was a fair and competent leader, but this incident had exposed a blind spot she hadn't even known existed. The next morning, Brenda called Evelyn Parker and offered to help coordinate the disbursement of JD's donation. It was a small step, but it felt like the right one. She also scheduled a meeting with her staff, determined to address what had happened openly. "We can't let our assumptions guide us," Brenda told her employees. "We need to do better for ourselves and for our customers." Some staff members nodded in agreement while others remained silent, their expressions guarded. Brenda knew it would take time to rebuild trust, not just with her team, but with the community. The story of J.D. Vance's visit and his donation quickly grew beyond Waco, sparking debates across the country. Opinion pieces and social media discussions explored themes of bias, leadership, and second chances. Some praised JD's calm approach and generosity, while others criticized Brenda's initial decision as a glaring example of prejudice. Despite the mixed reactions, one thing was clear: the incident had struck a chord. It wasn't just about a vice president or a red hat. It was about the power of small actions to reveal deeper truths about society. For Brenda, the lesson was painfully personal. But as she watched the Waco Community Relief Fund flourish, she found solace in the knowledge that something good had come from her mistake. Perhaps J.D. Vance had been right. What defined people wasn't their errors, but how they responded to them. Brenda resolved to prove that she could be better. And as she turned off the lights in her office that evening, she felt a flicker of hope that the door J.D. had opened would lead to something extraordinary. The aftermath of J.D. Vance's visit to the bank rippled far beyond its walls, transforming the small town of Waco in ways no one could have predicted. His words, his calm demeanor, and his unprecedented $500,000 donation to the Waco Community Relief Fund set off a chain reaction of change, not just within the bank, but across the community. Brenda Hartwell, who had once prided herself on her ability to make tough decisions, found herself deeply shaken. For years, she had believed that being a good leader meant enforcing policies with unwavering resolve. But JD's visit had exposed her blind spot. She realized now that her judgment hadn't been guided by professionalism, but by fear and assumptions. "I let my bias dictate my actions," she confessed to Diane during a quiet moment in her office. "I thought I was protecting the bank, but I see now that I was wrong. I hurt someone, not just anyone, but the vice president, and I made this branch look small-minded and unwelcoming. Diane placed a reassuring hand on Brenda's shoulder. You're owning up to it now, she said. That's a start, but what you do next will matter more than anything you say. Determined to make amends, Brenda threw herself into action. She reached out to Evelyn Parker, the director of the Waco Community Relief Fund, and offered her full support in coordinating the use of JD's donation. Evelyn, who had seen firsthand how the bank's involvement with the fund had been inconsistent over the years, was pleasantly surprised by Brenda's offer. I want to help, Brenda said earnestly during their first meeting. Not just to fix my mistakes, but to truly make a difference. This community deserves that. Evelyn nodded, her expression softening. We all make mistakes, Brenda. It's what we do after them that defines us. Let's work together to make this count. J.D. Vance's donation breathed new life into the Waco Community Relief Fund. For years, the fund had struggled to secure significant contributions, relying mostly on small local businesses and individual donors. Now, with $500,000 on the table, the possibilities seemed endless. Evelyn and her team quickly got to work, outlining a series of new programs and initiatives. The fund expanded its food distribution network, ensuring that every family in need could receive groceries weekly. It partnered with local schools to provide after-school tutoring and college preparation workshops for underprivileged students. A new financial literacy program was launched to help low-income families learn to budget, save, and navigate loans. To everyone's surprise, Brenda played a key role in the financial literacy program. Drawing on her years of banking experience, she helped design workshops that taught participants about opening accounts, managing credit, and avoiding predatory loans. She also personally volunteered to teach some of the classes. At first, Brenda feared that her presence would stir resentment or skepticism. After all, she had become a symbol of the incident that had sparked this movement. But as she stood before a group of young mothers during her first workshop, her apprehension faded. I'm here today, Brenda began, because I made a mistake, a big one, and I'm not proud of it. But that mistake taught me something. I can't just sit behind a desk and assume I know what's best for people. I need to listen, to understand, and to support. That's why I'm here, and I hope I can help. Her vulnerability earned her the respect of the attendees, many of whom came up afterward to thank her for sharing her story and providing practical advice. While Waco experienced tangible changes, the broader impact of J.D. Vance's actions was felt across the country. News outlets continued to cover the story, exploring its deeper implications. Editorials debated the significance of assumptions, the challenges of leadership, and the importance of empathy in a divided world. Some praised JD's calm approach, describing it as a masterclass in grace under pressure. Others used the incident as a case study to highlight the dangers of unconscious bias, particularly in professional settings. The story sparked conversations in workplaces, schools, and even church sermons. Bias isn't always loud, one pastor said during a Sunday service in Waco. Sometimes it whispers quietly in our minds, guiding our actions without us realizing it. But what happens when we confront it? When we open our eyes to the ways we've judged others unfairly? That's when true change begins. Corporate training seminars across the country adopted the incident as a teaching tool, encouraging employees to reflect on their own biases and how they might influence decisions. Within the bank, Brenda's leadership underwent a quiet transformation. She called a staff meeting shortly after the incident, gathering her team in the break room. I need to address what happened, Brenda said, her tone serious but calm. When Mr. Vance walked into this bank, I didn't see him as a person. I saw a symbol, a hat, and I let that cloud my judgment. That was wrong. And I know it wasn't the first time someone has felt unwelcome here. She paused, looking around the room at her employees. We can't let our assumptions guide us. We need to treat every customer with respect, no matter what they look like or what they believe. And that starts with me. Brenda announced that the bank would implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, herself included. She also encouraged her employees to share their thoughts and concerns openly, fostering a culture of accountability and growth. Over time, the changes became evident. Customers who had once felt judged or overlooked began to notice a difference in how they were treated. Brenda made an effort to greet everyone warmly, regardless of their appearance. She took the time to listen to complaints and resolve issues with patience and understanding. One afternoon, as Brenda finished helping an elderly woman set up an online banking account, she noticed a familiar figure approaching her desk. It was Mr. Hargrove, a longtime customer who had offered her kind but firm advice in the days following JD's visit. He handed her a small envelope, a knowing smile on his face. "Just thought you might like to read this," he said before turning and walking away. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note. "Pride may break us, but humility can rebuild. You've done well, Brenda. Keep going." Brenda felt a lump in her throat as she read the words. It wasn't a public award or corporate recognition, but it meant more to her than anything else. It was a reminder that she was on the right path, that her efforts to rebuild trust and embrace humility were making a difference. In the weeks that followed, Brenda continued to support the Waco Community Relief Fund, volunteering her time and expertise whenever she could. She also became an advocate for spreading J.D. Vance's message, sharing her story during community events and encouraging others to confront their own biases. While the public frenzy around the incident gradually died down, its impact lingered. The town of Waco, once shaken by the story, had grown stronger because of it, and Brenda, once humbled by her mistake, emerged as a better leader, one who understood that true strength came not from enforcing rules, but from embracing empathy. And understanding J.D. Vance had said it best: what we do afterward is what defines us. The days following J.D. Vance's transformative visit to First Horizon Bank were a whirlwind of change, not just for the bank, but for Brenda Hartwell herself. The media buzz had finally begun to subside, allowing Brenda to focus on rebuilding her reputation and improving her leadership. Yet the lessons she had learned from the vice president's visit were etched deeply into her mind. Brenda had spent her entire career believing that leadership was about making tough decisions, enforcing rules, and maintaining order. But as she reflected on JD's calm yet profound words, she realized that true leadership was about more than policies. It was about people. Determined to embrace this new perspective, Brenda worked tirelessly to create a more welcoming and inclusive environment. At the bank, she regularly checked in with her staff, encouraging open communication and collaboration. She also led by example, treating every customer with the utmost respect, no matter their appearance, demeanor, or beliefs. Her efforts did not go unnoticed. Employees began to notice the subtle but impactful changes in her demeanor. Brenda listened more, smiled more, and approached challenges with a humility that had been missing before. Customers, too, felt the shift. One elderly woman, a regular client, commented one afternoon, "You seem different these days, Brenda." "Kinda, maybe. It suits you." Brenda smiled, the compliment warming her heart. "Thank you," she said. "I'm just trying to be better every day." Meanwhile, the Waco Community Relief Fund thrived like never before, with J.D. Vance's $500,000 donation serving as a catalyst. The fund's donor base doubled within weeks. Local businesses and individuals were inspired to give, citing J.D.'s message about unity and understanding. The fund's programs expanded to include financial literacy workshops, small business grants, and housing assistance for struggling families. Brenda continued to volunteer her time, working closely with Evelyn Parker and the other volunteers. The financial literacy workshops became a cornerstone of the fund's initiatives, and Brenda took immense pride in leading them. Standing before groups of eager participants, she shared practical advice while weaving in lessons from her own journey of growth. "I'm here because I made a mistake," she would tell the attendees. "But that mistake taught me how important it is to treat people with kindness and fairness. We all have something to learn, and we all have the power to do better." Her honesty resonated with the community. Brenda's workshops were always full, and many participants left feeling not just informed, but inspired. One sunny afternoon, Brenda was finishing up a meeting with Evelyn at the Relief Fund's office when a familiar figure walked in. J.D. Vance, now without the suit and entourage, had returned to Waco on a quieter visit. Brenda stood, her pulse quickening as the vice president approached her. J.D. smiled warmly, extending his hand. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, his tone friendly. "It's good to see you again." Brenda shook his hand, feeling a mix of nerves and gratitude. "Mr. Vice President, it's an honor. I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I wanted to check in on the Relief Fund," J.D. explained, glancing around the bustling office. "Looks like my donation is being put to good use." "It is," Brenda said, nodding. "And it's inspired so many others to give. This community has changed because of what you did." J.D. smiled, his gaze thoughtful. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who decided to take that message to heart, including you." Brenda felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." J.D. gave her a knowing look. "We all make mistakes, Brenda. What matters is how we grow from them, and from what I've seen, you're doing just that." He didn't stay long, but his visit left Brenda feeling both humbled and uplifted. The story of J.D. Vance's visit and the lessons it inspired continued to ripple through Waco and beyond. The incident became a case study in leadership seminars, a subject for classroom discussions, and a symbol of the power of humility and second chances. For Brenda, the experience wasn't just a turning point in her career. It was a turning point in her life. She had been forced to confront her biases and shortcomings in a way that was both painful and transformative. But through that discomfort, she had grown into a more empathetic and understanding leader. One afternoon, as she helped a young couple open their first savings account, Brenda noticed a familiar figure approaching her desk. It was Mr. Hargrove, the long-time customer who had given her words of wisdom in the days following the incident. He handed her a small, neatly folded envelope. "Just thought you'd like to read this," he said with a wink before walking out. Brenda opened the envelope and found a simple, handwritten note inside. "Sometimes the hardest lessons teach us the most. Keep walking this path. You're doing great." Brenda smiled, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She folded the note carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, where she kept reminders of what mattered most. J.D. Vance's parting words during his visit echoed in Brenda's mind often. "What we do afterward is what defines us." She carried those words with her as she navigated her daily life, striving to embody the values of empathy, humility, and fairness. In the end, the incident that had started with a red MAGA hat and a refusal of service became a catalyst for profound change. It taught Brenda, her community, and countless others the power of reflection, redemption, and kindness. And so, as Brenda walked through the bank each day, greeting customers and guiding her staff with a renewed sense of purpose, she held her head high, not because she was proud of her past, but because she was proud of how far she had come and of the future she was helping to build. Because sometimes the most unexpected moments teach us the most important lessons.